Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf of Daily Cloud, and I'm so excited to have as our interview subject today Jonathan Perloe, who's the communications director for CAGV, which is Connecticut Against Gun Violence.org. And he's here because we are really honored and excited to have run an incredibly powerful essay he wrote about a new bill which updates an existing kind of gun control law in Connecticut. So welcome. Can I call you Jonathan?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Welcome, Jonathan Perloe.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to everybody about this bill, which saves lives. And there's a lot of states around the country, particularly following Parkland, that have instituted their own extreme risk protection orders. So we'll talk about that more, but it's a great opportunity. I think it's something particularly relevant right now, and I'll explain why later.
Oh my goodness. Well, I can't wait to talk to you more about the time sensitiveness of the issue of gun control. Obviously we're talking to each other. You're in your home, I'm in my home. We're in the lockdown of the coronavirus epidemic, and guns are top of mind for a lot of people. I'm just going to kind of jump in and share from my own life. I grew up, I'm a hippie from San Francisco, and I grew up around people who hate guns in any shape or form. I married a guy who works with guns, with firearms. I know. And we have firearms in our home, which is very, very surprising to me as a nerdy chick from the Haight-Ashbury. And so I really want to and so where I was going with that is that I went with my husband to the gun store, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say, here in upstate New York, because he's a private detective. So he carries a firearm in his work sometimes. Terrifying to me, but I've gotten used to the fact that there are gun owners in the world who are sane and who don't, who want, I was surprised to learn, the same kinds of common sense protections that many people in your world want. So I'm just sharing that because it was packed, like the gun store was packed at the start of the coronavirus lockdown. People were stocking up on bullets, prices were going up, and, there was a run on firearms. And most of those people are not the lunatics you hear about. They're not, they're there for what's called home defense or hunting. But there are lunatics out there, and that's why what you're doing is so, so important. So tell us about the way this bill, which kind of updates an existing bill, as I understand it from your essay, intervenes with people who are not in the most stable state of mind. They're not the kind of common sense, everything's okay gun owner. Go ahead.
Right. So the law is generally being called these days an extreme risk protection order. It's also known as red flag law. That's the common name, but we actually try to stay away from that because it's stigmatizing to the mental health community or people with mental health conditions. And this is really not just about, it's really not about mental health. It's about propensity to violence. So 20 years ago in Connecticut, there was an employee at the Connecticut Lottery, and he was actually let go, and his neighbors knew that he had a lot of anger, and they also knew he had guns, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. And he showed up at the headquarters one day and went around and killed all the supervisors.
Oh my God.
So at least 4 people were killed. And so this was back in 1998 or so. And the legislature at that time passed this law, which in Connecticut is called risk warrant, but we're starting to use the common term of extreme risk protection order, which provided a mechanism to remove firearms from anyone who is at risk of imminent harm to themselves or others. And when it was passed, it really was sort of considered this was going to stop mass shootings and homicides. What it turned out to be is it's more often than not used to prevent suicide, firearm suicide.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and that was unexpected. Although clearly in the bill it was to prevent risk of harm to self or others. So they anticipated that, but I don't think they anticipated that would be used more to prevent suicide than homicide or mass shootings.
Right. And Jonathan, let me just jump in with that phrase. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but a lot of people may not know that risk of harm to self or others is a legal phrase that has to do with when you can restrain someone who is having a mental health crisis. Isn't that correct?
Correct. And it is, and we'll talk about this a little later in terms of the protections for gun owners and respecting Second Amendment rights. But there are some very specific criteria that have to be met before the police can come in and remove guns from someone.
How do you guys know that it kept people from killing themselves?
A great question. A couple of years ago, there was a study done by an academic at Duke University. His name was Jeff Swanson. He did that together with some people from the University of Connecticut and Yale University. And they looked through all the data in Connecticut in terms of how this law is being used. And they went back a number of years. And that's where they actually discovered that it was about 2/3 or so of the cases were being used to prevent suicide or suicide and homicide, but not homicide alone. So they started looking at it, and through some pretty rigorous analysis, they found that for every 10 to 20 risk warrants issued, one suicide was prevented.
Wow.
And
this is people self-reporting, after it's all over, I'm glad you took my gun away because I was going to kill myself?
Well,
or
so
at least reporting that person was going to kill himself or herself?
So what would happen is someone, it was usually a family member, would come to the police and say, I'm really worried about my husband or whomever it was. And the police would do, a bit of an investigation, not a whole lot, because they were trying to do it quickly, and to sort of corroborate that there was a concern. And if they felt that there was a concern, they would then go to the court and ask the judge to issue the warrant, and then the guns would be removed.
How would the guns be removed? The police show up. That's the warrant, right? They show up with the warrant. They say, here's a warrant from the court. We can take your gun because you're at risk of harm to yourself or someone else.
Exactly. Now, so the way the process works, and it's a little bit, it's similar to the way a domestic violence restraining order, temporary restraining order is issued. At the outset, it's called an ex parte order, which is to say the person who you're taking the guns away, he didn't have any part of it. The police show up and they remove the guns, and then, but within 14 days, the person has a right to a full court hearing where you can present whatever evidence.
That's the next question. How long are you going to take the gun away for? Yep, go ahead.
Right, or even, are you going to take, are you going to keep the guns? And so there's a hearing, and the respondent can present the evidence saying, no, I'm not dangerous to myself or others. And if the judge concurs, the guns are returned. But in most cases, the judge does find that there is credible evidence to support the concern, and the guns can be removed for up to a year.
Wow. And what constitutes credible evidence? Like, I could see people, just devil's advocate, because we have a very nonpartisan or bipartisan audience, and that's what I love about our community. I can see a lot of gun owners saying, well, are these my neighbors who, are going to say I'm crazy? Is it someone who has a grudge against me? Someone who wants my girlfriend is going to say I'm crazy? Like, what's the evidence that would lead a judge to say I'm going to take away your gun for a year in Connecticut?
An important question. So the first thing is, the way the law is written, this is a means of last resort. So the first thing that either the police or the judge might ask is, did you ask them to, give the guns legally to someone else, or lock them up and give you the key? And there's a couple ways that you can prevent access to the firearms short of actually removing them. So this is a measure of last resort. Sure. But there are some criteria, and I'll just read them to you. So this is the criteria that the judge will consider. Has the person made recent threats or committed acts of violence toward himself or herself or anyone else?
Right.
Have they committed recent acts of cruelty to animals? Have they recklessly used, displayed, or brandished a firearm? Is there a history of use or attempted use of physical force? Is there a history of involuntary confinement in a hospital for people with psychiatric disabilities, or is there a history of illegally using controlled substance or abusing alcohol? So those are the criteria that the judge considers. And so it's not sort of like, seems like he's a bad guy, I'm just going to take his guns away.
Those are very rigorous. I mean, again, imagining myself as a critic of these laws, although I'm not, personally, I could see someone going, all of those are very rigorous, objective measures of someone who could plausibly commit terrible violence against himself or someone else, except the abusing alcohol. Like a lot of people, like, what is that? I have a few beers and I take my gun out and shoot a target.
Abusing alcohol.
Right. What is abusing alcohol?
Okay. Well, I guess, certainly there's still some subjectivity to this, but let's say the person, is known to be, to get inebriated a lot and, starts threatening people. And I think.
So that's what I didn't hear. I didn't hear that there was a combination of inebriated and threats, or inebriated and reckless behavior. Did I miss that?
So the law doesn't sort of say, it has to be two of these things on the list, but, and I'm not a judge and I haven't been in the proceedings, but I would imagine if the person just gets drunk a lot and isn't threatening anyone or, talking about, I want to kill myself, the guns won't be removed.
Right. Interesting. So I think a lot of gun owners, or a lot of people in the middle who want sane gun control but still believe in what they would call Second Amendment right to bear arms, would say those are very reasonable restrictions. Let me just say, reading between the lines, and as a feminist, you didn't really delve into this in your essay, but you mentioned it, but this really could keep a lot of women safe.
Well, this is interesting. We've been having discussions about that because, so in Connecticut, and this is not true in all states, but in Connecticut, if you file for a temporary restraining order and it's granted, and those are also granted on an ex parte basis, so like the abuser is not there, he gets to have a hearing later on. Now, and this was actually a law we just passed about 3 or 4 years ago, if a temporary restraining order is issued, guns have to be removed. They have to.
Wow. And that's a Connecticut law that exists.
That exists. And in fact, what happened was it used to be the case that once the order was made permanent, and that happens after the hearing where the abuser, the accused abuser is allowed to come in and again argue his case. If the order was made, what they call it permanent, it's really for up to a year, then the guns would be removed. Right. But the period at which, and it's usually a woman, makes a very difficult decision of, I'm going to leave this guy because, I've had enough, or my life is in danger, or my children's lives are in danger. So they will leave and they'll file for a temporary restraining order. And that period is the most dangerous period, that period of about 10 days. So,
and say studies have shown that over and over. It's when the woman decides to leave and starts making steps to leave that she's most at risk. Go ahead, please.
Exactly. And there was a woman in Connecticut a number of years ago who was killed the day before the hearing to see if the order would be made permanent. And so we passed. So it was like there's this glaring loophole where if it's permanent, you take the guns away, but if it's temporary, you can have your guns. Didn't make any sense. So we closed that loophole. And the reason I explain this is it's probably, if a woman is so concerned about her personal safety that she wants the guns to be removed, right, it's probably better to get a temporary restraining order, which keeps the person away, right, and takes the guns away. So in a sense, there's another mechanism to protect women in cases of domestic abuse. But the process is really similar. It's you tell the judge and you provide some evidence that is credible enough for the judge to say, okay, we need to do something right away.
Right.
And then, in a couple of weeks when everybody can get their stuff together, they come and there's a full hearing.
Right. So basically this bill would kind of streamline and tighten up an existing way of taking guns away from people who are suicidal or homicidal.
Right.
You know, until they can calm down and get evaluated, presumably get their guns back. Why did your organization think it was necessary to do that just now?
Yeah. So, so as we talked about, the bill was passed 20 years ago, and Connecticut was actually the first state in the nation to pass an extreme risk protection order law.
Can I just ask, was it hard to do it 20 years ago? Do you know?
I don't know. I wasn't there at the time.
That's that whole tragedy, so I'm sure there was support.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's right about when I moved to Connecticut, but I don't remember hearing about it. But one of the way the law was written was partly to address some of these concerns about due process, and due process is important. There's no question about that. And so the way the law was written, there was actually two things about it that we actually want to change, because we think in balancing gun owners' rights versus public safety, we think the balance right now actually is a little bit too much in favor of gun owners' rights. Mm-hmm. So the things that they wrote into the law were, one, only law enforcement or a state's attorney could go to a judge and ask for the warrant to remove the guns. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the police actually, when they applied for the warrant, they had to have two police officers had to sign the application. Mm-hmm. And so some of the problems we've been finding is in small jurisdictions, when it's midnight, there may not be two officers around. Right. And so one of the changes we're looking for is just to make it one officer as opposed to two officers.
Gotcha.
And
so
then,
really like making the existing law, from your point of view, more effective at what it already plans to do.
Exactly. And so so it was Connecticut and Indiana had passed these bills back in the late 90s. And then there was the Isla Vista shooting in California. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of another similar situation where the parents of the shooter were really worried about him, and they called the police. The police went and visited his apartment. Mm-hmm. But they weren't legally allowed to remove the guns, and it was a couple days later that he went on his shooting rampage. So it was soon after that California passed what they call it a gun violence restraining order, mm-hmm. and then Washington and Oregon followed suit. So there were about 5 states that had it, mm-hmm. and then Parkland happened, and once again you had a situation where people were worried about him, and they knew he had guns. And
that seems so common. Like, Jonathan, now that you're like reminding me and us of these, some of them very familiar stories, it's so common that people said, like, his psychiatrist will say, I was worried about him, or the teachers would say, I was worried about him, or the friends would say, or, you know, they're off their meds, or, you know, like, there's so much mental health. I see why it was called the red flag law, you know, right, so many signs before that became identified as stigmatizing. But sorry, go ahead. So yeah. California and passed a similar bill in the wake of another.
You know, then after Parkland, so right now, after Parkland, a whole bunch of states followed suit. And so there are now 17 states in D.C. all have these extreme risk protection orders. Okay. And when you kind of think about it in just like the common sense way, somebody can go and buy a gun, let's say 5 years ago, and he or she was in, you know, perfectly okay. And then 5 years later, he loses his job or whatever. And there's no law or background check process that is going to obviously catch something that happens in the future. Right. But it's people around us that know, you know, when there's something wrong, and they know that they have access to firearms.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the other changes we're looking at, the way most other states have it work is the person goes right to the court. The person who's worried goes right to the court and makes the application. And it's usually limited to family members in most other states. In Connecticut, we have this different process where it's the police who go to the court. And actually, one of the advantages of the Connecticut law is anyone can go to the police. So you could be a neighbor, a coworker, a family member, and you can say, hey, I'm really worried about this person. Right. But there are some situations, and particularly in cases, I think, of somebody who is suicidal, where you might not want to involve the police right away. Or let's say it is someone who, you know, really feels very strongly about, you know, owning a gun. and you don't want to start getting the police involved. And so the second change we're looking for is to allow family members and medical professionals to go directly to the court rather than going to the police.
Which I'm really struck by. It definitely makes sense from the point of view of, you know, so many people in the mental health community, as you said, will say often, and even people who suffer from mental illnesses like bipolar illness will say, I don't always know when I'm becoming manic, or, you know, when my meds need to be adjusted. My wife will know, or my husband will know, or my mom or dad will know. And so I think a lot of people would say these are common sense updates, really, of a law that sounds like it's been working well. Can you tell us about the study you mentioned in California that showed that these emergency orders are likely to avert mass shootings?
Yeah, so the research that's been done so far has been on the suicide side, and there was another study that looked at both the Connecticut experience and Indiana experience, and in both cases they found that suicide by guns dropped substantially in the 10 years after the law was passed.
Wow, that's really.
But it didn't change other rates of suicide, which was to say they were, it brought down the overall suicide rate, but there's sometimes, well, anyway, I won't get into that right now. But what there have not been are kind of academic studies looking at, has this prevented mass shootings?
Right.
And the main reason for that is they actually are much rarer than gun suicide. But in California, its law has been in place for a few years now, they looked at about 150 cases or so, and they found about 20 cases where it was, you know, you couldn't prove it, but it was pretty obvious that by removing the guns, they prevented, you know, a potential mass shooting. And there were 2 cases in Connecticut just last year. There was a young man in Norwalk, Connecticut, which is a little bit up the road from where I live. And he called his aunt who lived in New Hampshire. He said, "Auntie, I would like you to do me a favor. Could you buy some large capacity magazines?" So those are magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition, because I can't do it in Connecticut. It's against the law. And she was a little concerned. And she talked to some family members, and then she went to a local police department in New Hampshire, and they told her to contact the police department in Norwalk, Connecticut. And they kind of looked at the situation, and this guy had other scrapes with the law, so they knew who he was, and they filed for a risk warrant or protection order. And when they went to his apartment or house, they found hundreds of rounds of ammunition, several guns, a hand grenade.
Oh my God.
He had a titanium vest plate. He had camouflage clothing, and in his garage, he had 4 30-round magazines. And on
shooting that's been averted, I think it's safe to say.
Pretty clear. And on his social media, he had been talking about that. And then there was another case, and these both happened in Connecticut last year.
Did the kid appreciate in retrospect that the gun was taken away at that moment? Like, does anyone ever say, you know, I hated it at the time, but that was the right one?
That's a good question. I don't know. One would hope so. But one thing that is the case is a lot of times, so when these risk warrants are issued and the guns are removed, the court notifies our Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services so that the people can get treatment. And so that's great. It actually, in many cases, acts as an entryway into getting the behavioral health treatment they need. So there have been a number of anecdotal cases around the country. There's been several in Maryland in the first couple months after they passed theirs, where it's pretty clear that the people that they were moving the guns from had plans to have school shootings. So the evidence is there.
Yeah, and I guess you don't need people to say thank you for taking away my guns when I was distraught in order to know that a law like this is working from your point of view. What you need is to avert catastrophes. And again, I'm really interested to hear what gun rights advocates would say and what they've said to you about this bill? Because I'm finding it very hard to imagine what the argument would be against this, except a very theoretical one, which is real, which is the Constitution, one could argue gives the right to people who are off their meds to own guns. It doesn't say anything about you need to be in psychiatric treatment. So can I ask, not that it's your job to paraphrase what gun rights advocates say, but what does the other side say about this approach?
Right. So,
or are they in favor of it?
Well, so that's a good question. I'd say reasonable gun owners are in favor of it. And after Parkland, both Florida and Vermont passed their own ERPO laws, and those two states have some of the weakest gun laws in the nation.
Interesting.
So there clearly is, a feeling.
The strongest gun laws in the nation, but yes.
What? I'm sorry, what?
Oh, from the other, we have to be nonpartisan. So I was just saying, from the other side's point of view, some of the strongest gun laws. But I hear what you're saying.
So the Giffords organization rates states based on the strength of their gun control laws, and Vermont and Florida have routinely been graded F. But what was interesting is after Parkland, they passed some of these laws, and Florida also passed you have to be 21 years old to get an assault rifle, and their grades went up appreciabably.
Interesting. Interesting.
So
what you're saying is, it sounds like even in strong Second Amendment states, there's support for this kind of approach where it's not like you're a law-abiding gun owner who hunts, or you're worried about home defense and you're a law-abiding person. I never thought I would hear that there are reasonable gun owners who want reasonable restrictions, but over and over again, I've heard reasonable gun owners say, we don't want people in a state of mania or who cannot manage themselves or who are suicidal or homicidal to have guns. That's reasonable.
Yeah. So clearly there are, some people are approaching this and kind of, bringing what we would say is common sense. That said, there's a whole lot of opposition to these types of laws.
Really? Even these types?
Oh.
Like NRA objects to this actual bill?
It's interesting.
5448?
I was before we got on the call, I just wanted to check to see specifically what the NRA was saying about extreme risk protection orders. Mm-hmm. And what they say is, we don't have any problem with them as long as due process rights and Second Amendment rights are protected. On its face, that sounds fine, and we feel the same way. The Constitution is the Constitution, and we respect it. However, if you look at their actions, which I think speak much louder than words, so this comes from their website. The current ERPO laws in California, Oregon, Vermont, and other states suggest that the NRA supports those laws. This is false. The NRA strongly oppose these laws because they do not protect due process rights. We will continue to oppose confiscation schemes such as these. Now, here's the thing about these due process rights. The legislation in, I don't want to say every state, but I would imagine virtually every state, is similar to Connecticut in that the firearms are removed with some evidence, and then there's a hearing to see whether the order is made permanent or extended. Mm-hmm. And when people, that is a process, the ex parte process of taking away someone's rights, and whether that is the right to go into your home or the right to bear arms, there are legal processes in place, and so temporary restraining orders, as an example, follows the same process. I don't know if every state in the country has it, but I imagine they do. They haven't been overturned. They are not, there's no constitutional challenges that say that's not allowed.
Right.
In the same way, there have been no successful constitutional challenges to extreme risk protection orders.
It's really interesting. Well, I guess that's a good note to end on. Presumably it's not a new approach. These approaches have been around for 20 years, right. And you're saying no one has taken this up and said this is wrongly decided, this is restricting our rights under the Constitution. So it sounds like it is constitutional, at least for now, to remove guns from a distraught person who's suicidal or homicidal.
Right. And just one last thing to add is thinking about it. So their concern, and, you know, I can understand this, people abuse things, is that somebody is going to, you know, try to take their guns away because, you know, of beef or whatever. When somebody goes to apply for a warrant from the court, you're signing the application or affidavit, whatever it is, on the pain of perjury. And that's a felony.
Right.
And so the idea that, you know, and there's been like their kind of common scenario is that a woman is going to take the guns away from her husband or partner, and then she's going to get a gun and kill him. And I got to say,
that's a common narrative of this is the worst.
That is a common narrative.
Right. That says a lot about patriarchy, man. I did not.
And you know, the fact is, if she was doing it as a harassment mechanism, and it wasn't obvious to the court, she would be signing an affidavit and committing a felony. And most people don't want to commit felonies. Right. So, and the fact is, like where are the examples?
Sorry, Jonathan.
Yeah.
So back to what we started out with, it's not like, you know, my neighbor who just doesn't like me can take my gun away. There's this very high bar, it sounds like, to meet before that happens. And it sounds like there's a lot of consensus, even though the NRA will always, you know, object to a lot of people.
Which it's unfortunate, you know, that they just can't see their way to supporting any common sense gun laws.
Well, let me ask this as my last question. I'm really interested in the fact that, you know, with abortion, with gun control or gun rights, I do see that there are these like establishment organizations and spokespeople who kind of, you know, their job is to take the extreme position and never budge. Whereas most people, if you speak to them, and that's why I believe in Daily Clout and conversations like this, you know, they're willing to engage with the nuance and to, you know, meet in a sensible, common sense way with reasonable laws that are good laws, right? That take into account everybody's concerns. So I guess I'm interested that your organization is called Connecticut Against Gun Violence and not against guns. So would you say that you guys have a more kind of meet in the middle, let's talk to the opposition, moderate position? Or do you know what I'm talking about with this extremism on both sides with the issue of guns? What's your view of that?
Yeah, so we are against gun violence. We're not against guns. We do think that it is important that people understand the danger of guns, and we can have a whole nother session, which I would love to have, about why guns don't make you safer.
I'd love to have that as a follow-up conversation.
Somebody decides that they feel they need a gun, that's their constitutional right as long as they meet the criteria. Here's the thing, though. I would say, yes, there are, you know, there's this extremists on, you know, both sides of any issue, but I would challenge the statement that most of the gun violence prevention, or if you want to call them gun control groups, are extremist. I don't think you will find any national organization or any of the state-based organizations like our own that are advocating for, you know, taking away people's guns and banning guns. It's just not true. And so, and that's the unfortunate thing, because the NRA, which is the major organization on the other side, and actually there's another one. There's one called the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade organization, and coincidentally is headquartered in the National Shooting Sports Foundation. It's headquartered in Newtown, Connecticut. And both these organizations have not supported a single piece of legislation. They don't do it at the state level. They don't do it certainly at the federal level. And so I feel very confident that on the other side, they are extremists. And I'm not saying that all gun owners are extremists, but the organizations that are that purport to represent them, they are extremists.
I agree with you. And I think I misspoke. I shouldn't say, because I have no knowledge, that gun control organizations are extremists. What I can say is that from my own demographic as a, you know, urban Jewish nerd surrounded by urban Jewish nerds and, you know, nerds of other stripes, right? It was not, we tend to be absolutist, that you have to be a lunatic to own a gun. And I think that comes from, you know, I think that's a whole other conversation, like that's very culturally inflected. We never had the guns, you know, like, you know, if you have a history of victimization, you either want to arm yourself or want no one to be armed, I think. That's another philosophical discussion. But it wasn't until I met gun owners that I got over my deep prejudice, really, against the idea that anyone could be sane and own a gun. So I'm glad to hear that gun control groups like yours are, you know, willing to, you know, engage with the other side and reassure gun owners, which I think they need reassurance that, you know, these controls are not going to take their guns away and violate their Second Amendment rights if they're responsible, common sense gun owners. And I wish the other side would, you know, follow suit organizationally.
What actually would be really helpful for the overall movement is for some of those gun owners to actually get involved and use their voices, because they, you know, if they come out and say, hey, we think this is sensible, they have obviously so much more credibility than us that are viewed as, you know, gun grabbers.
Gotcha. Well, that's a wonderful shout out to end on. So what can people do, whether they're gun owners or gun opponents, if they support HB 5448? What's your call to action? Yeah.
So life has been turned upside down in the last few weeks, as we all know. So if you live in Connecticut, you can reach out to your state legislators and say, you know, I would like you to support this bill. If they go to our website, which is CAGV.org, they can sign up and get our emails, and then we, you know, kind of tell them what to do. Right now, it's not clear whether our legislature is going to come back into session, so we don't know like what the status of this bill is. So if not this year, we'll be back next year. I think in other states, there's a couple things that people can do. There are some bills in Congress, and in particular, Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham, who is not a gun control guy by a long stretch, has been in discussions with Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut. He's my senator. And they are trying to advance some type of legislation for extreme risk protection orders. And it probably won't be a federal bill. It'll probably be a bill to provide grants to states to implement their own.
That's cool.
So if we want to try to do something on the federal level, get in touch with your two senators and say, you know, I would love to see some measures passed at the federal level implementing extreme risk protection orders. And then they can, depending on what state they're in, they can do the same with their state legislators.
That's fantastic advice. And who's the sponsor of HB 5448? Because that person should hear from people, right?
Yeah, so in Connecticut, without going into too much detail, we have a 2-year legislative session. In the second year of the session, which is this year, bills are raised by committees, not individuals.
Not individuals, okay.
So what we do is we ask our supporters to ask their legislators to co-sponsor the bill, and that's a way of showing support.
And so getting right down to Democracy 101, how do people who live in Connecticut, who are really the target audience, you know, as great as it is to have a national and international audience for this, really you who are watching in Connecticut, you need to take action. And how do people find out where their state legislators are and what the contact information is if they live in Connecticut?
Good question. I'm trying to think. I'll send you some information afterwards. But if they just Google Connecticut General Assembly, and they'll get to the Connecticut General Assembly website, and there's a little link to find your legislators.
Perfect.
And you put in your address, and it pops up everybody has a state representative and a state senator. Send them a quick email and say, I would like you to co-sponsor HB 5448. The bill to strengthen our extreme risk protection order.
Wonderful. And we'll also embed the bill cam, which is interactive, of HB 5448 in this video. Text.
Excellent.
And we'll also embed that link, the Connecticut General Assembly link, where people can enter their address and find out who their state legislators are. And that's a good thing, not just for this conversation, but for the future, because you should be bothering your state legislator all the time. And I'm sure you agree with that. Lastly, you're a 501c3, so people can make a tax deduction contribution to your organization. Is that correct?
We have both. So the arm that does the legislative advocacy is a 501c4, but we also have the Connecticut, the CAGV Education Fund, which is a 501c3, and so you can get to both of them from our website. But I think, you know, we'd love to have contributions and things. We were supposed to have a annual benefit luncheon in a couple weeks, which is now going to be a virtual luncheon. So we do have a need to raise money. But I think what you said, Naomi, is getting in touch with your legislators is like job number one to make democracy work. And one of the reasons I got involved in this movement is recognizing how much power people have. And you can really make a difference. One of the reasons Connecticut has very strong gun laws is because we have citizens who care about it, and they talk to their state legislators and their congressional representatives as well. But it makes a difference. There's no question. And frankly, we wouldn't succeed if we didn't have supporters who were willing to contact their legislators. We're like a conduit to get people to act.
Fantastic, and we'll do all we can to get the word out as well. So everyone, what a fantastic conversation. It's Jonathan Perloe, Director of Communications for CAGV.org, Connecticut Against Gun Violence.org. The bill is HB 5448, and you've heard what you need to do. And go out there, and if you support this bill, let your representative or let your legislator know if you live in Connecticut. If not, you heard what you need to do, and we'd love to have you on again. So thank you for the work you're doing. So important to have this conversation. Such a thoughtful approach to legislation, and thank you. In these difficult times, it's great to have this uplifting moment. Thank you, Jonathan Perloe.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. And if you have questions, post them on wherever you're seeing this, and we'll try to answer them.
Wonderful. Take care. Be well. Be safe. Bye-bye.